Welcome to Season 2 of Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. This season, we continue to explore the key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and unpack the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. However, it's not only me guiding you through all these crucially important questions this season, but I'm also joined by my colleague, Paul Mason.
Hello, and it's great to be here again, Victoria, with our distinguished guests. We're talking today about the CRINKs. China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, are they a systemic threat to the West, to our country, to our national security and way of life?
Yes, that's the topic of the day. And let's begin with a quote which was expressed by Lord Robertson, who's leading our Strategic Defence Review back in July. He said, "We are confronted by a deadly quartet of nations increasingly working together." So declared Lord Robertson, head of His Majesty's Government Strategic Defence Review, on launching the reappraisal of Britain's defences on the 16th of July 2024. The idea that the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran and North Korea might be colluding has been dismissed for years as a fantasy. But the evidence is mounting that this deadly quartet, or CRINK, might be colluding to usurp and even replace the prevailing international order. So today, Paul, we will try to unpack with our distinguished guests the following themes: the basis of the alignment, history and current geopolitical context, the current strategic threat posed by the CRINK, and also how should Britain and its allies and partners respond and seize the strategic initiative. So let's introduce our guests.
Yes, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and prior to that, for many years, Professor of War Studies there. Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman has published widely and written widely on international history, strategic theory, nuclear weapons issues, as well as commenting on current security issues. And sitting next to me is James Rogers, who is the co-founder here at the Council on Geostrategy, where he specialises in geopolitics and British strategic policy. He previously held a range of positions, including the Baltic Defence College and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And James, great to have you with us on the podcast, bringing your knowledge and focus onto this, what is effectively the global challenge of the 21st century.
So, Sir Lawrence, shall we crack on with the question? What is CRINK in your view?
I think CRINK is a useful construct to remind us that there are a number of different countries that in their own way are hostile to the West and work together. I think we have to be careful with it, like BRICS and other things. It can seem a little bit too neat. What they all have in common is at the moment, in addition to a degree of hostility to the West, is they're keeping Russia in its war with Ukraine. That's, at the moment, as far as Russia is concerned, their most important function. But they have differences, and they have different agendas, and they have different vulnerabilities. So I think it's a useful starting point for a discussion, not about how this is sort of gelling together as the great threat of the 21st century, but as something that has been working closer together, but in some aspect maybe prized apart, which is, I think, normally the best response to these sorts of alignments.
It was, I think, a British economist who invented the term BRICS, wasn't it? It was just an acronym that we threw together to understand what was going on in the global south. And lo and behold, it's now an actual alliance. They have a conference. Is there a danger that in our conceptual kind of throwing together of these powers, we are ourselves creating a more coherent adversary than actually exists?
That's my concern. I think, there's no doubt that without the help of Iran, North Korea and China in very different ways, Russia would be struggling even more in this war than it is. So, one shouldn't dismiss the fact that they can work together. But it doesn't seem to me that Iran is a natural part of this, and I think Iran is quite vulnerable. If you're going to identify one of these that could well have used the term regime change, it would be Iran. China, Russia is a very complex relationship. and getting in some ways more tense, even as it's very important for China that Russia doesn't lose, and they're quite happy to see the West embarrassed. They've got their own agenda, their own needs, which are quite different from China. So I think that's my concern. As with the BRICS, as you mentioned, it starts off as a way of talking about what were then emerging economies that are worth investing in, and all of a sudden it becomes a much more suspicious grouping, which now they're adding to, although I think it's one of these groups that's far less than the sum of the individual parts.
And James, in terms of the ideological cohesion, there isn't much, but what there is, what's the strategic effect of that synergy, insofar as it exists?
I think what we can determine from this is that there's a deep hostility to the United States and to democracies more generally. But I think that manifests itself in different ways. So, I mean, if you go back over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, I think it's the case that Russia and China are the two major components of this so-called CRINK. They're the most powerful states because they have the greatest resources behind them and arguably the most determination. But I think they've kind of approached their hostility to the prevailing international order with a slight difference. I think Russia has tended to be a kind of a spoiling force. It's had a sort of an anti-systemic approach, whereas China's has been more counter-systemic. China has far more resources than Russia does, and therefore, and also the technological and the sort of systematized economic reach. And it's had more of a counter-systemic approach towards the international order. Neither of them, I think, want to fundamentally change elements of the prevailing order because it's actually benefited them, whether that's Russia's kind of infiltration into European energy markets or China's infiltration into the global economic and trading system. So they're not, I don't think they want to change it whole scale immediately, but they certainly want to re-engineer it to their own advantage, and China probably more so than Russia, even if Russia's approach within the Euro-Atlantic space has been deeply destructive and even has kind of neo-imperial overtones in relation to countries such as Ukraine.
So, Lawrence, would you agree?
Yes, I think if you look at their sort of joint communiques, they present themselves as upholding the international order and multilateralism and so on. I think elsewhere, I don't think Russia's taken that seriously in that role, but China is. China gets its officials into key positions, works international organisations quite effectively, goes around the world offering inducements and projects and so on. Not always successfully, but it does. Russia can't do any of that anymore. And China is a country with which the West has to engage. It can't just say we don't like them and go away. Whereas Russia and certainly North Korea and to a degree Iran are much more marginal to the workings of the international economy. So I think that is the main distinguishing feature of them, and I think we're going to see that because obviously the disruptive force that's also in the back of our minds with all of this is the Trump administration, and we're seeing already that Trump does not see China as a country that can easily be just dismissed. They have to find a way of working with China, even as he wants to put on tariffs. So I think that is one of the fault lines. North Korea is just a thing in itself. In some ways, one of the most dangerous parts of all of this. But nobody has to engage with it, other than the fact that it has nuclear weapons and is prepared, unlike China, to actually go and fight with the Russians.
I mean, it's a remarkable thing to think that there is an Indo-Pacific country at war with a European country.
I mean, it's quite important because they're defending Russia as opposed to invading Ukraine. So this is one of the curiosities of dealing with Russia. Is it has its own view of legalities.
And I think we should remember that one difference is China has a overt, very Marxist, very orthodox Marxist theory of national power. Yeah. And it is stated that by 2049, the anniversary of its liberation, it wants to be the dominant power in the world. And it has, I was studying this week, that the equation that they use between hard power, soft power, and the rest, I would be interested in both of your views about how that affects the dynamics of the CRINK alliance insofar as it exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the interesting thing here, in a way, is that the CRINK, I mean, lots of people have spoken about the potential alignment between Russia and China and the others for some time. I mean, there has been talk of a so-called dragon bear for some years. But what's really interesting about the current period is that, in a way, it's being formed, or it's coming together through sort of acts of Russian desperation, in a way. So, it's the fact that Russia has not been able to succeed in its overall strategic objective in Ukraine, at least as it was initially conceived back in 2022. And I think because of that, and because it's drawn on the Russian state, and there's now been a 3-year-long war, effectively, which has drained Russian resources quite substantially, in a way that I think no one really foresaw back in 2021 or even in 2022. That the Russians have looked to others, whether it's the North Koreans, this sort of pathetic hermit regime on the Korean peninsula, or they've looked to the Chinese or to the Iranians to help prop them up. And in a way, that's actually drawing this entity into being. I mean, you could say that even to that extent, it's also a bit predated. I mean, you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that's been there for some years, so that kind of gives it an animated formal form. But that's of course a broader organization. The idea of the CRINK, I think, it really does come down to this fundamental issue of Ukraine. It's a Euro-Atlantic or a major conflict within the European space, and it's drawing in now external actors to support Russia. And I have heard over the last few weeks, various quite senior European kind of intellectual and thought leaders saying that actually we should draw the Chinese even more into the conflict because they'll help to police the Russians. I think this is wishful thinking, and we should be very, very careful the extent to which we draw in these external powers, which probably do not have our interests at heart.
I mean, I think going back to your point, Paul, I think if you go right back to the starting point of the People's Republic of China, it was second to Russia. It was the junior partner, and Mao was prepared to see that Stalin was the great leader. And they were both Marxist-Leninist and so on. And then even at the end of the Cold War, Russia was still a superior economic and political force to China. But China is now by far the dominant partner in this, and this really rankles with Russians. I mean, I think we should not underestimate just how difficult it is for many Russians to accept their dependence upon the Chinese, who don't. I mean, the Chinese keep them going in very important ways because they ignore sanctions, but they don't give the sort of help that North Korea does militarily, and they're taking advantage of the economic opportunities that are being given, and they still have relations with Ukraine. So I think, the idea that I think Ischinger raised at Davos, which was put down very quickly, about Indian and Chinese peacekeepers is for the birds. I think it's nonsense. But I think you can see the Trump administration assuming that they find some way of talking to the Chinese, seeing the Chinese playing a role in whatever peace effort is going to come now. So I wouldn't. And Zelensky saw that at one point when he saw when the Chinese first outlined their peace proposals that actually this would be all right, strictly speaking, for Ukraine because the Chinese still stick to the charter and don't support actually the illegal annexation, though they never quite say that.
So in your view, what are the primary goals or interests in the ongoing war against Ukraine from the Chinese side?
I think the Chinese is perfectly happy for the West to get distracted and drained by this, but it's embarrassing if they've this country with whom they have this sort of forever partnership, closest friends, is struggling. I don't think they're impressed by the Russians, and they don't. Their objective, I think, the Chinese, is to undermine American hegemony and dominance of the international order. They quite like the idea of breaking the Europeans off from the Americans. But Ukraine makes that difficult because you know, Ukraine is more important to the Europeans than it is in the end to the Americans.
There's a downside, of course, for the Chinese in one sense. A Ukrainian air defense expert said to me, and this might be a controversial statement, any technology that's not in use in Ukraine or the Israel-Gaza conflict should probably be regarded as obsolete, i.e. the level of learning that both those conflicts are giving to the participants is something that China can't directly participate in.
The Chinese are watching it very carefully. I think there's some truth in that, but you know, a lot of what's being used in Ukraine is Cold War vintage, and you know, one of the most effective weapons the Russians have at the moment are dumb bombs. They're not the most smart. I think what is true is that the adaptability of both forces, particularly the Ukrainians, and the development of drone warfare, that is moving to different levels. And I think that lots of people are just watching that, wondering how they're going to catch up. And I think, you know, as we can see with the North Koreans, you know, supposedly one of the attractions for the North Koreans of going into Kursk was to learn how to fight a modern war. You know, so far, I don't think they've had a particularly great time of it. And I think the Chinese will be aware of that too, that it's one thing to have a great and expanding army, or navy particularly. It's another thing to be sure that you know how to use it in battle.
So what impact has North Korea's involvement and Iran's involvement in this war so far had on the course of the war?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think it's been relatively, I mean, it's been important, but it's not been, I think, decisive. I would say that China's support, more indirect, but in terms of providing financial support for Russia, or at least not condemning it openly and as loudly as the Euro-Atlantic countries, notwithstanding, you know, the support for the Charter and so on, has actually been more important. But I don't know, maybe you disagree.
I think undoubtedly China's support is the most important, just because Russia economically would be really struggling without them. What the North Korea, I mean, I don't think what the North Korean land contribution has made an enormous difference, but they are providing rockets and missiles and a lot of artillery, not of high quality, but it's there. The Iranians have you know, kept the drone threat growing against Ukraine. So one part of the war, which is the attack on Ukrainian towns and cities and critical infrastructure, has benefited from that connection. It would have been harder to sustain it without. So it hasn't been decisive, but it's certainly been an important part. I mean, the ammunition provided by North Korea, to be honest, the ammunition provided by South Korea to Ukraine has actually been quite important in keeping both sides going.
It's we've got some stats here. I mean, 70% of Russian machine tools, 90% of microelectronics imports are from People's Republic of China. Total trade, 240 billion. The PRC is Russia's top trading partner. And it's said, according to South Korean intelligence, that Moscow is paying Pyongyang $2,000 per soldier per month for participation. So
that's cheaper than their soldiers.
Absolutely, but nevertheless, what we're seeing is a political economy of CRINK. In other words, it's developing, and I wonder where if we could, you know, there's several lines of inquiry, but the one highest in my consciousness is having seen that purported sixth-generation combat aircraft fly on Boxing Day. And then seeing this, the new AI tool that's come out of China. While we're all fascinated by this, the exchange of dumb bombs and not very good soldiers, sitting in the middle of this alliance is the industrial powerhouse and possibly scientific powerhouse, the 21st century. And are we really understanding the strategic impact of that?
Well, I think, I mean, one thing here is also, I mean, in relation to this is Russia's alignment. So, I mean, it's quite an interesting sort of take, because Putin has invaded Ukraine, and in a way he's weakened Russia's strategic leverage. So prior to the war, Russia had quite a good position in the international system relative to its own, you know, standing its own power base, it was it had got a great sort of stranglehold over Europeans in terms of energy dependency. It had some alignments with China and with other countries. It was kind of playing off, it was hedging between all the different actors. But what his decision to invade Ukraine seems to have done is basically close off that other side. So he's now increasingly beholden to China, and what Sir Lawrence was saying earlier about in the past the Russians were the senior actor, now they're very much the junior actor, and I think this has in a way compounded that. So I mean they are becoming increasingly beholden to China, a part of the Chinese kind of sphere of influence almost. If this continues, it will probably become more so, because there are very few other major powers, with the exception perhaps of India, that would be prepared to engage with them, at least while they're invading Ukraine in the way that they are. So I think this is the fundamental issue. The dependency that Russia is accruing through its invasion of Ukraine, or re-invasion of Ukraine, is the thing that's drawing or pulling this CRINK together. And I mean, that opens up lots of different issues as to whether we can wedge into it. I think that's probably quite unlikely given the stakes involved. But I suppose the bigger game here, in a way, besides supporting Ukraine, is also to ensure that this CRINK doesn't increase its stranglehold over the so-called global south or middle ground countries, whether that's in Africa or South America or parts of Asia.
I think they're very different, aren't they? I mean, Russia's involvement in Africa through the Africa Corps, as they nostalgically call it, is in trouble. I mean, they're having trouble in the Sahel now, even in the CAR. And they've been pushed out of Syria. I mean, this is huge. So they had standing in the Middle East because they helped Syria to the Assad regime to stabilise itself. And when the crunch came, it's not that they just abandoned them. They tried and failed to stabilise the situation. And now it's gone, and they're out. And I mentioned earlier, I think Iran is quite vulnerable. I mean, it's got an incredibly weak economy, a population that is utterly hostile to the regime, a divided regime, an ailing leader. I think that's, of all of this, the I bit is probably the weakest. China, if you took Russia out of the equation, and India, Iran and North Korea, we'd still be worrying about China for the reasons Paul gave. They're a manufacturing superpower, if nothing else. There's debates about the latest AI innovation and to how innovative it actually is, but it's pretty, it gave everybody a shock. So they're a big power with whom we're going to have to deal one way or the other in the future. And it's not something that can be pushed to one side. Russia, Iran and North Korea, I think, are on very different trajectories. And Russia, I mean, the big issue to try to think ahead a bit with is what happens when one way or the other this war ends. Because winding down the war economy in Russia will be something to do. I mean, it will be quite difficult. All sorts of consumer activity has been set aside in order to put factories producing stuff that all of a sudden won't be needed or can't be afforded or whatever. And I don't think China's going to be that interested after that. I think that it's got bigger fish to fry. So I think at the moment it's a formidable collection, and a lot depends, and which is why prediction is always impossible, and even more so at the moment, what the Trump administration does with all of this. If it decides that the CRINK is a real thing and acts accordingly, and there are people in the Republican Party who do certainly think that, then they will help forge it together. If they start looking for wedges, maybe they can find them. So I think there's a lot. My view is there's a lot to play for in all of this. I'm not wholly fatalistic about it.
Before we turn to the question of how can we respond to this challenge, I recall that there was a meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping on the 21st of January, I believe one day after the President Trump's inauguration in the US. discussing comprehensive partnership and also strategic cooperation. So in your view, how do you see this comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation evolving in the upcoming years?
Well, I mean, I think it'll evolve as it's evolved so far. I mean, China has been very clear this is not an alliance, and they've had it in the communiques. Despite the fact that Russia wants a new gas pipeline, it hasn't been funded and it's not being built. So I think China's objective in this, and I think, again, I think it was Putin who really wanted this this call, because Putin, I think, has been, I don't know how surprised he's been, but noted that the hostility or the contempt, I think, in Trump's comments about Russia and the war. He needs to build Russia up at the moment. He needs to show his alliances are in, or he needs to show that his support is in good order. So I think it's very important for him. And I think he'll be, he's the driver. If you look, sorry, going off in tangents, but if you look at the communiques, I haven't looked at the latest one, but if you look at the previous ones, what you see is Russia agreeing to all sorts of dubious Chinese initiatives, sort of great civilizational forums and so on.
Yes, the fancy wording.
And and China giving very little in return. I think this is very one-sided, and so I think while the war goes on and while Russia needs it, they'll put a lot of effort into this. I think there'll be a backlash in Russia as the war ends, because, as James indicated, they've cut off their Europe. I mean, you had a whole generation of Russians that looked to the east, looked to the west. Now they've had to look to the east, and they'd rather look back to the west, but they can't because all that's been cut off. And I think that is going to be why whether there's going to be a real post-Putin reorientation of Russian foreign policy, which is looking, goodness knows how far ahead, but it is to me a bigger strategic question than the fact that while the war goes on, China and Russia will somehow stick together.
I think it's fair to say that we haven't seen a comprehensive statement of the Labour government's China policy.
One's supposed to be coming soon, I think.
Hopefully. But to try and sort of intuit it from behaviour, it is erring towards the let's drive a wedge, isn't it? And which is interesting. What would a smart strategy be towards the emergence, because we are talking about China is magnetising every other element in that alliance towards its own ends. We know that it has a long-term goal, and I keep going back to it. It wants to be the dominant power, and their definition of dominance is that everyone else not just accepts and coexists with them, but respects them culturally, and they have a right to ask that, given what other nations did to them. So how intelligent do you think what we're doing at the moment is?
It's a really, it's the question in a way of the century, perhaps. Because one of the big risks is, notwithstanding what Russia is doing in Ukraine, is if and this is based on all sorts of different trends and predictions and conjectures and so on. But for some years we've had this kind of perspective, and I think it's been challenged a little bit more recently, that China is in this kind of upward trajectory. It's only a matter of time until China surpasses the US in terms of economic output. China is on a roll, and by the middle of the century, if not a little later, China will be by far the dominant power. It has over 1 billion people. There's a huge sprawling economy that moves into lots of different sectors. It's developing technological ascendancy in various areas. It's got a degree of determination, I think, there as well, at least behind the Communist Party. What you were saying earlier about this bid by 2049 to be the dominant power. So you've got that, and we've thought that, but in recent years that's become a little more suspect, and it's not clear now whether China will even surpass the US. Not by the middle of the century, certainly, and maybe not even later. Of course, things could change. There are things we may not be able to see, but there is a big risk here. That on the one hand we want to see Russia, stopped in Ukraine. And we want to see the return of Ukrainian territories, Ukrainian sovereignty, the threat that Russia poses to the Euro-Atlantic system reduced. But on the other hand, we don't want a situation whereby Russia becomes a part of this, even more so of a Chinese kind of order that may have even greater systemic complications for the world than it currently has had over the last year. So it's almost a balancing act between those two. And this is drawing together, and I think in a way that maybe even some Americans don't fully understand, this idea of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific connectivities. You can't focus just on the Indo-Pacific anymore because the Euro-Atlantic is also in play, and vice versa. And we need to get to a more kind of, I would say, sophisticated understanding as to how that's occurring, and also how the two sides of the Atlantic, the European side with the UK and the North American side, as well as our other allies and partners, whether Australia, Japan, South Korea and others, can help to prevent this from happening.
I think the Chinese problem needs to be broken down. I think the possibility some people put it as peak China, we've seen it. It could be true. What we do know is their demographics are awful, absolutely awful, as indeed are Russia's. And they have an aging population before they're fully developed, which is unusual. They've got a debt crisis. They're struggling to get the growth that they've expected, and it's partly because they are still Leninist. It's still a Marxist-Leninist party trying to run a very capitalist economy. So the first point is in that sense they don't seem quite as scary as before, sort of powering on regardless. But secondly, you can't ignore them because where they are at the moment is still pretty impressive and important, so you have to deal with them. Then we have to work out what we're worried about. And I think there's the human rights issue, and it sort of becomes obligatory for Western leaders to say, well, we'll have a partnership with them, but we'll remind them about our human rights concerns, which I suspect they just listen to and smile politely back. But then you've got the question of whether they're interfering with our national security. And, to some extent, you sort of feel these, I think particularly in Xi's earlier period, maybe he's a bit more sober now, the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy that no slight can go unpunished. There used to be this thing, well before Xi, where if you invited a Chinese delegation round, they'd sort of sweep the place electronically, even as they were your guest, because they almost couldn't help themselves. This is what they did. And I think those sort of things, I think governments do find it difficult to deal with. And, we see with the whole TikTok debate and so on. So I think that is actually a harder part of the piece to work out. How do you unavoidably engage with China, because there are lots of things that we need are manufactured there. They don't particularly open up their market. That's something that will be there, but we've still got to engage with them and preserve our own technology and strengths while that's going on. It's very much an economic relationship, complex one, but economic. And it spills into a security relationship. Just a sort of final point. I don't think China has any interest in being sort of a superpower, great power, in the way that the United States is. It doesn't have the alliances. It doesn't particularly want the obligations. The Chinese show very little interest in trying to sort out other people's problems. What they want is respect, that acknowledgement of past slights and the old colonial regime, which they haven't forgotten about, even if we have, and the ability to operate freely, economically. After that, I don't think they're that bothered. It's a big country to run without worrying about the rest of the world.
I think I slightly differ with what Lawrence just said about China in terms of its willingness to be a great power. I mean, you could make the same argument about the United States or even the United Kingdom. In the past, when they were at a certain position, they didn't want to have these global commitments, and there was a strong isolationist streak, which even today I think in the US we see coming out. But when you get those obligations and you are in a position that you can exercise that power, you've built it up over a period of years, it can put you in a different set of circumstances, and you may need to embrace them in some ways. Now, I completely agree with you that China doesn't have this kind of global system of alliances that the United States has built up over the years, or even the UK for that matter, nor does it have a number of military bases and naval stations that circumvent the globe. But it is building up a formidably powerful navy, and I think that's something that we've not really paid attention to.
I think that's to do with the things that concern China. I mean, they're not. I mean, the Pacific is their sea, I mean, or South China Sea and so on. I mean, they want to operate there. But look at the Middle East. What has China contributed to anything to do with the discussions about the future of the Middle East? Absolutely nothing. They've steered clear when people who've been part of the Belt and Road Initiative have got into trouble. They haven't really gone out of their way to help. I think they've got a very clear sense of where their interests lie, and I think the Navy follows from that. And I think they want to be seen as a major power. I think, another example, not just the Navy, is the build-up of their nuclear capability, beyond which in the past they said they needed, but they want to show that if Russia has these number of missiles and the US has, they can have that number too, which is again a problem for Russia. Putin used to say, China's an economic superpower, but we're a nuclear superpower. Well, China's going to be the same sort of nuclear superpower. So I think that matters to Xi a lot. But I think that's different from every time there's an international problem, somebody feels the need to call Beijing in the same way that they'll still call Washington.
I agree, but in 10 or 20 years, I think it might be rather different if they can continue to build up.
But then you've got the question of why do you bother? I mean, which is the isolationist response. The US has taken on these responsibilities, so we notice when they decide to abandon them, we sort of struggle on the sidelines. But if you haven't taken them on, why actually do you want to? What do you gain from them? It's not always great fun being a great power in that sense, if you don't need to. So I think they've got their greatness is important to them in terms of everybody respecting them. Their ability to do the things they want to do, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea or so, that's important to them. But I'm not sure they have interest in the Middle East, but they'll handle those, I think, economically, rather than feel a need to make a show of force.
I do note this large build-up of their navy, though, and it's not just that they're building small numbers of experimental ships, like 10 or 15 years ago, but huge platforms being developed that are for projection, logistics vessels. There's a flirting with overseas naval facilities. There's talk of opening them in parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East. We have the first one already in Djibouti. There's also discussion about others around the Bay of Bengal and so on. So, I mean, and also even in the Pacific, which the Americans, the Japanese, the Australians are also very nervous about. So there is something, I think, happening. I agree with you that they're not to the same extent as the United States yet, but if the economic weight continues to grow, even if more slowly than in the past, and if the economic interests continue to accrue as they have been over the last sort of 10 or 20 years, there is a possibility that they will become significantly more important than they are at the moment globally. They may not reach the same level as the United States or even some of the European countries such as ourselves, but nonetheless, there is that, there are driving forces there.
Yeah, I don't wholly disagree. I mean, I think a lot of it's to do with raw materials and so on. I think that's what's guided an awful lot of their investment. I think it's more a political question, as we do things in order to protect our interests, but what distinguished in the sort of old concepts of international order the really great powers from the rest was they took on the responsibility for the security of weaker states, offered protection, guarantees, and so on. I just don't see China doing a lot of that.
Are they doing that a little bit with the CRINK? I mean, we've just been talking about Russia and the dependency.
But
they get sucked in.
They're doing what's good for China. I mean, China benefits. China hasn't suffered as a result of supporting Russia. It's gained. It's gained energy at good prices. I don't think that's the same. They haven't done anything. I mean, they don't have a particular relationship with Iran. And their relationship with North Korea has been slightly strained by the fact that North Korea has got a bit closer to Russia.
Yeah.
So I think that just the Chinese are cannier. So it's not, I'm not playing them down.
Yeah.
I just think they are, and they're clearly giving themselves capacity to do more than they've done in the past. But I don't think they're going to just take it on in order to make a show.
Well, there's some evidence that we've discussed which indicates that these four nations have been working more actively together in recent years, and of course it is to be seen how this will develop. But as things currently stand, we've touched on this a bit a couple of minutes ago, but I would like, just before we finish this recording, outline the main action points for us as a country. What is our strategic response to this? And also, what is our strategic response together with our key allies and partners to this phenomenon called the CRINK?
First, the key actor in this, obviously, is the United States. We've got a new and hard to make sense of administration that has talked, remember in the previous version, Trump had almost a romance with Kim Jong-un, which didn't lead to anything much in the end, but he obviously treasured the relationship with him and went out of his way to meet Kim Jong-un, has talked about, even now, about how he's going to sort out the world with Xi and bring peace, has even mentioned the possibility of an Iranian deal, because you've got the whole nuclear question coming up this year. You need something really sorted on that by June, if anything's going to be sorted at all on the rescuing of the nuclear deal, which he, of course, undermined in his first term. And then he's going to talk to Putin soon. So he's positioning himself to talk, not collectively, but individually to all members. And we don't know what the UK should do in this. I think on China, we just work with everybody else. I don't think we've got a particularly distinctive policy from everybody else. We're all going to have to work out some sort of combination of partnership and wariness with China. With Iran, I think the UK is not in a bad position. We have an embassy in Tehran. We still know a bit about the Middle East. We've got relations with the Gulf states who are important now, and the Saudis. So I personally, I think we should concentrate on Iran as the weak link in all of this, and one where, because of Syria, us and the other Europeans can do quite a bit, while continuing to oppose Russia as best we can.
In thinking about the wider question, what advice would you give to those designing the diplomatic message behind Carrier Strike Group 25?
Firstly, I think we need to de-risk and, where necessary, decouple. There's no point in making ourselves dependent on the Chinese, the Russians, let alone the Iranians or the North Koreans, but primarily the Chinese, I think, here. And I mean, for some of the Europeans, it was the Russians in terms of energy dependency. So de-risk. We shouldn't allow them into our systems where we know that they're going to actively undermine us. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks about Chinese social media. I always ask, would we have allowed the Soviet Union to control one of our major television stations during its height? Probably not. So de-risk and decouple. The second thing I think we need to refocus on is military rearmament, or some degree of military modernisation and growth. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. The average, if you average it out between 1949 and 1989, for the UK alone was 6.3 to 6.4%.
Quite a difference.
Quite a difference. And if we are saying that the CRINK or the Chinese or the Russians are more of a threat today than the Soviet Union was, and some are making this argument, I'm not sure it's true. But if we are, then we need to calibrate our own defences accordingly. And then finally, I think we need to, to some extent, appraise our allies and partners. We've got our close allies in Europe, and we've also got some new allies in Europe, such as the Poles and the Ukrainians. and others along the northern flank of the continent that we need to focus quite strongly on, given the changing balance of power within Europe and where the new threats are emerging. But we also need to think about how we engage with our other partners, overseas in other parts of the world, whether that's the Indo-Pacific or even in parts of Africa and South America. And to draw into this the issue of the carrier strike group, that I think plays a role here. So the UK does want to signal to its other allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, the Japanese and the Australians, as well as countries in Southeast Asia, that it takes their concerns seriously, but at the same time it wants to show that there is a connectivity between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and also that Europeans are interested in what's happening in that region and vice versa. So it's good to see that the Norwegians will be joining that group as it goes into the Indo-Pacific, but it will also be active in the Euro-Atlantic. The carrier strike group is often seen as something that's connected to the Indo-Pacific, or the tilt as it was called, but remember it was also incredibly active in the Euro-Atlantic. It undertook strikes against targets in Syria. It was very active, or parts of it pulled off to go into the Black Sea and poked the Russian tail off Crimea, and it's not just for Indo-Pacific issues. It's to show to show a UK presence and to draw together allies and partners, and also to signal that we take their security seriously. So I think you can factor these all together and you come up with something that approximates a response.
So Lawrence, James, thank you so much for joining us today and for this fascinating conversation, and also a debate between you both as well. We benefited massively, right, Paul?
Absolutely, and I think we're all just thinking. I think we're all just thinking that there is so much of the unknown about this. With the Soviet Union, you kind of knew roughly what you were facing, but the variables are large. So we should all be respectful of what we don't know.
I'm sure we will continue this conversation in the upcoming episodes in one way or the other. But for now, thank you so much for listening to Defence Talks, Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems. You can find our upcoming podcast episodes and our previous episodes on our website. Please visit www.geostrategy.org.uk/defence talks. And until next time.
Goodbye.